Thomas in Houston. He was a very good student. He'd always be sitting in this very simple room on his camera. You know, he could only answer emails.
Let's say in his first and the founder, as in France, for example.
Yeah, think about what I said about the monastery I was at.
Yeah.
That wasn't just Wimmer's thing. Wimmer came to a country that was going to.
So we are here on the sidelines of the Summer Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas. I'm here with one of the lecturers, one of the speakers, Dr. Matthew Minerda. Very thankful to you, Matthew, for reserving some of your precious time for us. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's absolutely great to be here in the Czech Republic. Come with my family, tail end of a nice trip to Eastern Europe, and how better than to spend it with a bunch of people who are eager for Thomism, theology, philosophy, praying together, in all of it. It's a great event, actually.
Thank you
So
so
yeah,
much.
really a pleasure.
In your lectures, which are very abundant because our friend Father Kajetan Kari couldn't have come finally, so you have aborted a few times, or you have touched on several times the question of digital phenomenon, AI, in the light of the Thomistic notions as is knowledge, habitus. First objection or question or objection would be, is it even relevant today to treat these things, this phenomenon which is very modern, very recent, in the light of someone who lived 800 years ago?
I was thinking about this quite a bit during my last lecture. So I did these ones for Father Cuddy, and I had to split the lecture where I talked about human knowledge, right, and sort of we'll compare that to AI, right? So we know something about human knowledge. What does this tell us about AI? Which that by itself is interesting, right? What does St. Thomas, who is a reader of Aristotle's De Anima and, you know, some Neoplatonists, going to tell us about knowledge? Which I think we had a lot there that was quite relevant about what the nature of knowledge is, the being of knowledge. I mean, in a way that I think none of the other major schools of thought, even today, really adequately and deeply address. So just even in the ability to sort of address just what human knowledge was, it was almost obvious to sort of the conversation that there's a depth that every time you go back to touch Thomas, he reminds you that, you know, there's a reason the church has chosen him as common doctor. But the second half of the lecture was split. It was far apart. I did other lectures in between, and then that first lecture was paired with the second half, where all we did were the angels. So that, think about someone who's a secular person comes in and they visit the room by accident, right? They're looking to go to the bathroom, and somehow they end up on the third floor of the building, and they stumble into my lecture, and they say, oh, this is on AI. Maybe I'll be interested. And they hear me lecturing on angelic knowledge. It wouldn't seem relevant. But we spent time with the philosophy of pure spiritual knowledge, and it gave us all kinds of tools for talking then about how AI tempts us to treat knowledge, research, our relationship to others in the world in a way that's almost like falsely angelic, right? And it gives you kind of interesting insight, because if you've spent time talking about the human and now the angelic, and you see how it's very wrong to think of human knowledge as though it's angelic. Human knowledge is a very different thing than what angelic knowledge is like. There's a kind of falsity that's built into every temptation to the angelic. And it was, interesting then to get the participants to see how, talking about the angels tells us something very relevant for discussing, how AI tempts us away from the human to try to be falsely human. Mm-hmm. And that's just that's one of these interesting things about Thomas, is that it's perennial enough that something even as strange as the angels, as difficult to discuss, right? It's a very spiritual matter that's very distant from our experience, but still metaphysically important, has a bearing. Could say the same thing for Habitus. It would just seem very boring talking about habits, moral philosophy, and what's its relevance, but something similar there too. I mean, giving a kind of different tool from the toolbox of notions from Thomas. So, yeah.
I would ask about the Habitus in a few minutes, but can you just develop a little bit more? In which way is the look of the modern man on the AI in a way resembling the perspective which would concern more the angel. Is
Yeah.
the instantaneity thing?
That's really it, is that instantaneity. Now, you put a prompt in and you ask a question and you get maybe an explanation, but also then, a response of, sorts, a conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
But human knowing is a very difficult affair, right? You start from experiences. You spend time reasoning, defining. It takes a lot of work just to define your terms, right? We were always having this joke in the lecture about how do you define what coffee is. I'm an American and my coffee's watered down, caffeinated water, what is it? Very difficult to define even something like that. So the work of reasoning for a human is a long, difficult process. And it's also discursive, right? We reason from premises to conclusions. And it's really important to understand the conclusion in light of the premises. The angel's knowledge is not at all like that. The angel has a kind of instantaneous knowledge. It passes from one thought to another with a kind of directness or immediacy that is not native to us. And there's something about those AI answers, about just getting the result immediately, that is, it's like a false angelic knowledge. Mm-hmm. The difference is that we end up not really understanding. Whereas the angels, at least, when they know in their way, they're understanding immense bits of knowledge, right?
Sure.
But
they have the real intelligere.
Exactly.
But these machines don't have this spiritual knowledge.
Correct. And that was another theme we talked about a bit in the other, when we talked just about the nature of knowledge. In what way is sort of just manipulating symbols, not knowing, not
exactly.
knowledge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And at the same time, the man develops this knowledge, and there is this question of habitus, which is deployed. And as you have rightly underlined, this is the real human deployment. We are really being qualified, let's say, ennobled. Is it English?
Yeah, I think that's ennobled. No, that's it. Yeah.
Ennobled by this deployment of habitus, even an intellectual habitus, like art, like scientia. And when we simply transpose the task on the AI, he makes a quick production, which is completely exterior. But as you have said, we are circumventing all this beautiful work that makes the man real flourishing, because he is deploying his nature in a good way through the habitus, through the virtues. And all this is now lost because of this transposition.
Correct. It's as though, if you could just plug yourself in and if you could get all the right answers for everything, for every speculative question, for every moral question, for every artistic question. I don't think that's actually possible. But if you could, you would miss the entire human condition of lifting up our organic nature, or in another way of thinking it, letting both the light of reason and grace go down through our constitution and organize us, because that's what we talked about with Habitus, right? It's the kind of disposing of the parts of who we are as a complex being to be ordered toward our perfection, right? And so, you're in a certain sense not being human if you're just sort of always executing the result of some other algorithm. Right. I mean, God has constituted us to be the agents, not only the agents of our acts, but even to be kind of reflection of both reason and grace in our very being. And that's what habit enables us to do. Absolutely. So there's something very awfully demonic seeming about something that turns us from that, actually. I don't usually talk like that because I don't like doom saying, AI is the demon. Sure. Yeah. It's a little too strong language because I think that gets clicks online, which might be good if you want to use this video online. But it's not quite. I think it's not the most mature way to answer. But there is a kind of demonic temptation there because it's so opposite of what we're called to be. Right? When we try to go beyond the human, we don't become superhuman. We in a way become subhuman. Right?
True.
So
even though for transhumanism there is the question of superhuman level, but of course it's achieved by means which are not appropriate, and even based on anthropology, which is false, isn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. But that's a kind of materialist anthropology, right? A materialist anthropology for which we're just I mean, we're our component parts, whatever that matter is, and there's no idea of a kind of formal unity that has a dignity because of what it is, right? That's an important thing. I always used to tell this to my students in bioethics, actually, right? We tend to talk about human dignity as though it's kind of like we're rational creatures, like, and it's, you know, it makes it sound like we're going to conquer the world by being intellectual creatures, and there is something of that, right? I mean, this garden and all of this is a great example of like the kind of the conquest of human beauty, right? But of course, part of human dignity is that the dignity of our rationality is in this limited embodied life that we live, right? That a true human dignity is lived out in our bodies, right? And then in disposing our bodily powers, exactly. Right? And so that's what's missed by transhumanism, exactly. is that actually, you know, God is good enough to be able to give a true dignity precisely to us as finite, right? Which is, we don't have to depart from the human condition for that. Yeah.
So of course Aquinas is very important for these subjects, and if we say let's say like this, could we find the relevance of Aquinas for the contemporary problematic in some other ways, or even we are very quickly touch the question of conversions, very often connected to the discovery of teaching of Thomas Aquinas. Could you treat a little bit on this?
Yeah, it's a great example to come back to a conversation we had at lunch the other day. There's a reason that I was willing, and I'm willing for years, to suffer being suspected by my Byzantine, my Greek Catholic brethren, as being a Byzantine or Greek Catholic Thomist. I find that Thomas offers me too much in his school, even a good way of reading the tradition of the fathers that are dear to me, right? There's a kind of currency to Thomas that, you know, there sometimes are debates about how to understand him, certain positions, yet the great principles, the structure, the conclusions of Thomas seems to be alive for me, not only in my life as a Greek Catholic, but about so many topics. Mm-hmm. And this is why Maritan's Degrees of Knowledge, when I read it years ago, I couldn't understand most of it at the first time. But I saw here a man reading Thomas and answering questions about the sciences, about the nature of knowledge, right? The big epistemological questions that seemed unanswered in my classes otherwise, right? Mystical knowledge, metaphysics, but in a way that was current, right? I mean, there's a way in which the Thomism isn't just a historical thing of the past, or, you know, the thought of Thomas. It's a living tradition that bears fruit. So I think that kind of gestures in the first direction, right? And you're then pointing out that there is this phenomenon of those who convert from an interaction with Thomas. You know, when I sometimes meet online these younger people, or maybe not all younger, who become very impressed with Thomas. And I always remind them, you know, let's remember then too that, you know, Thomas is born in the heart of the church, right? So ultimately what you're seeing here is a fruit of the Catholic life. And so, of course, you know, don't let Thomas be the ceiling of your Catholic faith. But it is amazing. It's an amazing, you know, motive of credibility, right? That the church in her, you know, history, which is, you know, mixed and up and down, and nonetheless, you know, produces saints in every age, but also produces doctors, right? And Thomas is the common doctor. And it's a real motive of credibility to say, this community has these sorts of men and traditions that can answer questions that well. Yeah.
And if we go a little bit further in a more general perspective, what are your propositions? Like, if we could think about the development of the situation. So we have the new phenomenon of digital culture. We have touched upon that. We have also the new way of, or let's say the phenomenon of massive conversion of adults in France, in the United States. Sometimes, as we have said, closely connected to the classical teaching of St. Thomas. And maybe it's one of the resonance of St. Paul's, you know, where the sin has abounded, the grace has superabounded, if I say more or less well in English.
Yes.
So what are your takes on the development of this situation. On one side, we have deformation, which is connected to these new phenomena, a lot of new vices, etc. And on the other side, we have this even more vigorous call for salvation, for the truth. How do you think this is gonna develop?
Well, look, not a prophet. You don't ask Minerda to prophesy, in in the middle of Czechlands. But that being said, I think of the angels here, is what I think of. One of the things that torments the demons when they're fallen is the fact that they still retain a natural desire, actually, in their nature for God, right? Except they've also chosen to turn from Him. It's like being torn apart, right?
Sure.
So we have the blessing, in a certain sense, that we're temporal. In many ways, it makes us, we're so much weaker than the angels. We're not purely spiritual, right? But the experience of being in a state of mortal sin, which is sort of like the preamble of hell, right? Still has the possibility of conversion, but you experience in the state of mortal sin, you see the relics of grace kind of pulling you. God is always by actual grace pulling you to Him, but also too your nature is dragging you toward Him, right? And you're experiencing something of this conflict, like the demons do, right? Of having turned yourself from God and yet being hounded by God, right? And so in the midst of that, I mean, if anything, it becomes more tense and deeper, right? Like you're like a bird caught in a net or something, right? And you're aware of the fact that you want to get out. And it creates a situation where, finally exhausted by the fact that the world's not going to offer you salvation, you might finally listen to Holy Mother Church. Maybe. And I'm not trying to preach negatively, right? Sure. I mean, we all do this in little ways, right? Like where God lets us go and we fall and then learn from that fall. But I think that there is something possible in our culture's kind of status. Sometimes people who are very pessimistic look at it, they see it and they see that it's sunset, right? We're just actually in sunset. Sunset can be confused for dawning too.
Sure.
I think it's very important right now too. There's a lot of tension in different church communities and within the Catholic Church, and I think we should have a certain hopefulness, that the dawn of eternity really is in God's hand, and it happens all the time through His grace, because eternity begins in seed in time. And I mean, that's what is sort of desired by those who are exhausted by the world, even though they can't always put words to it. And that should give like a real zeal to those, especially who are in a state of life that requires them to be apostolic. I'm just a layman. I've got a family to care for. But it should give all of us, as we all participate in our own way, even by our baptism in Christ's priesthood and prophecy. And so really should encourage us to, in our lives, right, bring the truth of Christ, the truth of grace, the truth of the Trinity in us to a world that's actually more and more both unaware of it and yet hounded by it, because it's unsettled by the state in which we find ourselves.
And you're doing this task even here in the middle of Europe,
in the
Czech Republic,
in the middle of
at this moment.
Yes.
So thank you very much.
Absolutely.
For these excellent thoughts and for the time of our discussions. And
thank you for the invitation. I mean, it was just wonderful to come to Eastern Europe. It really was. So I appreciate it very much, and this was really enjoyable.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Matthew.
And now I very quickly will respond to my wife, who, if you saw me at one point going like this, I realized, why is someone calling? I had the key.